Good evening and welcome to another one of our online talks. And I'm delighted to welcome back Andrew Long, who will be talking about something I'd never heard of, BRIXMIS. I'm sure he's going to explain more about that, and the secret Cold War. This live webinar is being streamed on YouTube. I figured it out. It seems to be working, but we'll find out later. As usual, this will be an hour, 40 minutes of talking from Andrew, and then about 20 minutes of questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, not the chat, because it confuses me, but I think you all know that, which is why you put it in the chat. As ever, a big shout out to our funders, the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust Fund, and Arts Council England. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Andrew.
Good stuff. I need to share my screen, don't I now?
Do indeed. We rehearsed this, so hopefully it'll work.
Yes. How does that look to you?
That's perfect.
Wonderful. Well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to be back. I've been having a nice chat in the meantime, and it sounds as though these talks are going from strength to strength. So it's good to be part of it again. Yeah, we were trying to cook up some ideas for future talks as well. So yeah, quite excited by all that. So this evening, I'm going to talk to you about my latest book, which is called BRIXMIS and the Secret Cold War: Intelligence Collection Operations Behind Enemy Lines in East Germany. And you you may remember from my previous talk, which was a little while ago now, that I talked about BRIXMIS in that, and that was a taster, if you like, as to what was going to come with this book. It was like I practiced on Secrets of the Cold War, and now I expanded it to the full book. So it's been an absolute joy to research and write. I've been working very closely with the BRIXMIS Association. I'll explain what BRIXMIS is if you're not familiar with it. But the BRIXMIS Association is made up of veterans from the units past, and they're very active and very keen to spread the word. So they've been fantastic in cooperating and helping me get access to not only the archives but also with the veterans. So that's been at the heart of this book. So let's now move on a little bit. It's quite important to put this book in context. We're obviously talking Cold War, so we're talking from the end of the Second World War up to the, let's say, the early 90s, various different definitions, but that's the one I tend to use. So I'll just rattle through this quickly. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but post-war Germany split into 4 occupation zones. These are maps from the book, by the way. So you've got the British zone, the American zone, the French zone, and the Soviet zone. The 3 Western zones, the British, French, and American, they became the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, DDR. Berlin itself was 100 miles inside the Soviet zone, inside East Germany. And that was also split into 4 sectors, as you can see on the map here, split in a similar way across the victors of World War II. You had West Berlin and East Berlin. And then in 1961, the infamous Berlin Wall physically split off the Western sectors from the East sector. The only access to West Berlin, I write a series of books about Berlin, and I talk about it as an island city because it was literally the only access to West Berlin was from West Germany via the specific road, rail, and river connections. And these were called corridors. And you can see on the map on the left there, the Northern Corridor, the Central Corridor, and the Southern Corridor. And these terminated in what was called the Berlin Control Zone, which was a circle that went around all of Greater Berlin. That's a relevant point. We'll come to that later. So let's move on to the next slide. So BRIXMIS. stands for, well, it's an abbreviation for the British Commanders in Chief Mission to the Soviet Forces of Occupation in Germany. And thankfully, they called it BRIXMIS, or else we'd be here all night. Those who served in it were known, called it the mission. It was a unit, it was a sort of concept that was created in 1946, in September 1946, so pretty soon after the war ended, in an agreement between the Soviet occupation forces in Germany and the British. They realized that they needed to establish formal communication channels between the two powers, liaison channels, and that's an important word. We'll keep coming back to that word, between the sort of neighboring former allies. This became all the more important pretty much as soon as the dust had begun to settle, as the ally became potential foe and the battle lines of the Cold War were drawn. So a chap called Lieutenant General Sir Brian Robertson, he was the deputy British military governor, and Colonel General Mikhail Malinin from the Soviet occupation forces put their name to this agreement, and it became the Robertson-Malinin Agreement, again, thankfully, RMA. And what this did was formalize military liaison between the two powers, and they established reciprocal, there's another important word, reciprocal missions in each other's zones. So here we have, on the screen, we have a copy of the RMA. It was, I don't think they actually signed it because they didn't expect this agreement to last more than 6 months. It ended up lasting unchanged for 44 years. So that's nobody really bothered about whether they actually put ink to paper. The item at the top there, number 2, is a pass, the BRIXMIS pass. Now, this was a vital document issued by the Soviet forces to mission members, and it gave them access to, gave the bearer access to the GDR. It was like a passport. The vehicle also had a pass, as you can see there in the top corner, and each vehicle that they used for their work, we'll talk about that again in a minute, had its own unique number plate, and it was designed to be a high visibility number plate. So it was very obviously a British military vehicle. The Americans and the French signed similar agreements with the Soviets the following year, and as well as the British mission in East Germany, the Soviets had their own military liaison mission, which was called SOXMIS, and that was located in the heart of BAOR in West Germany. So this liaison took place at various places. So they had a formal HQ, which was known as the Mission House, and you can see this is the Mission House in the top picture from 1958, and it's in Potsdam, inside East Germany, and that's quite important. So this mission house, it was quite a grand villa, was primarily for entertaining and protocol work, but it was also a stopping off point where they could fill up their snack boxes and catch up on the latest gossip as well. So we've got the mission house from the front, and then the back, it was a beautiful villa with landscape gardens going down to a lake. So it was actually a very nice building, but it was literally right in the middle of Potsdam, which is inside East Germany. There was a mission house warrant officer. He was in charge, and he lived there with his wife and family. And they had an East German domestic staff, which is quite interesting because all these domestic staff, gardeners, cooks, housekeepers, they were all Stasi or KGB informers. The British knew that, and I think the staff knew that they knew. But anyway, this game went on, but they basically couldn't be trusted. It was also never proven, but it was generally assumed that the house was bugged by the Stasi again, the Stasi being the East German secret police. The phone lines were definitely bugged, because I've got reports from a former guy who worked on the electronic surveillance side of things. So the phone lines were, but it was never proven that the actual bugs were there, but they assumed they were. And basically, they didn't talk shop inside the building. They went outside and sort of talked in the cover of trees. But the Stasi were also adept at using long-range microphones from across the water, so they had to be really very careful. You had to talk almost like with their hands in front of their mouths to avoid being heard. There was also a rear HQ, and that was in West Berlin. And that was the administrative side of the mission. And that was in a place called London Block, which was one of the buildings in the Olympic Stadium complex in West Berlin. So to get from West Berlin, get from the rear HQ to the forward HQ, they had to cross the border, the international border, and that was via the Glienicke Bridge. And you can see a picture there at the top, and that was taken actually by a mission from a mission Chipmunk aircraft. The west is on the right, the east is on the left, and that bridge is quite a famous bridge. The East Germans, for example, called it the Bridge of Unity, which is, of course, is a very communist way of saying the very opposite of what it meant. But that was their way. It was the famous Bridge of Spies that, for example, the very famous exchange between Rudolf Abel, the Russian spy, and Francis Gary Powers of the U-2 shoot down. And of course, there was the Tom Hanks movie of the same name. So the Bridge of Spies was the only access for the missions and actually diplomatic staff as well from West Berlin into East Germany. So mission personnel would have to run the gauntlet of the Soviet checkpoint. It doesn't look very much from the top photo, but you can see from the bottom photos how intense a checkpoint it actually was. They had to go through this ritual of presenting passes. They handed over their passes. They would take all the information was taken down by the Soviet guards, and then of course it was then passed straight to the Stasi, who would then try their best to disrupt things down the line, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The design and configuration of the barriers changed over time. It was lift-up poles, electrically operated gates, massive concrete blocks to create a chicane. And there was also probably various other nasties going on. But it was basically designed, it was a very heavily fortified international border. So the picture on the left is a very rare picture. In fact, these two are very rare pictures taken from the east looking west. Generally, you wouldn't be allowed to have your camera anywhere near these checkpoints. But this is actually taken by a friend of mine who was a former US bandsman in the Berlin Brigade, and they'd been doing a gig at the American Mission House, and the equivalent, and they were coming back in their coach, and he snuck his camera out and took these pictures, which I'm very grateful that he did, because you get to see the very complicated series of barriers there. And then, would you believe it, in the bottom right, he got a shot of the final electronic gate, and there happened to be a BRIXMIS car coming in the opposite direction. So there you go. How's that for karma? Anyway, so that's the famous Glienicke Bridge, Bridge of Spies. So liaison, I mentioned this word earlier. Liaison took various forms. One of the key roles was raising and escalating protests, so sorting out issues, basically where there'd been a confrontation, an issue, an incident between the Soviets and the British. And fundamentally, it was the only point of contact between these two military powers. There was no diplomatic contact in the early days, and irrespective, the diplomatic staff that came in the mid-70s didn't represent the military. So the only point of contact between the two occupying military forces was via BRIXMIS. The BRIXMIS had a a Soviet counterpart, but also based in Potsdam, and they were called the Soviet External Relations Branch, or SERB. You'll hear me mention SERB. Now, SERB was a very small unit. There's some pictures of some guys there at the bottom. They're all SERB officers, but they were all GRU, the Soviet military intelligence, or KGB. And there was lots of formal but also informal socializing and entertaining going on. Only the Soviets, because of course the British and the Americans and French did not recognize the East Germans from a diplomatic perspective, not through until the 70s, but actually never from a military point of view. So that there was no socializing with East Germans, but there was formal entertaining with the Soviets. For example, the Queen's Birthday Parade, that was very much the hot ticket. It took place at the Olympic Stadium, a very grand affair, and quite often there was a member of the royal family there taking the salute, but also VIP visits and various other formal events. And you can see there's a brigadier there who was Chief BRIXMIS in having a good laugh with his Soviet counterpart. But there was also a lot of informal socializing with their Serb counterparts. And it was either at the mission house, at the Soviet Potsdam Officers Club, the equivalent of their sort of officers' mess, and bars and restaurants and that sort of stuff. And you can see various drunken antics there. There's the again a couple of Serb officers wearing a couple of British caps. There's on the more formal side, I love that photo at the top, the black and white one. The guy's straight out of Central Casting. He looks like a Bond villain, doesn't he? He's about 6'5" as well, but yeah, quite an interesting looking guy. And I do wonder what the Soviets would have made of that guy in a kilt. That must have been quite unusual for them. But anyway, this socializing was very important. It could build useful relationships, especially when there was an incident, because the people who were sorting out the incident were people you could have been boozing with the previous weekend. So it was a really strange paradox, socializing with their sworn enemies. Very unusual. So the business side of things, all that socializing might make you think that BRIXMIS was all about champagne soldiering. Well, anything but, I think is probably the best way of describing it. Very soon after it was formed in 1946, it evolved into a very highly effective intelligence collection operation. This operation, military operations tend to have a sort of reasonably short lifespan, 2 or 3 years perhaps. This operation continued uninterrupted 24/7, 365 days a year until the mission closed in 1990. That's 44 years of continuous operation, which is quite something. So basically, the tour, which was the way it was all done, the tour was dispatched into East Germany in marked vehicles with the personnel wearing uniform. Their job was to observe and record the activities of the Soviet and East German militaries. So you had a ground tour. Now, this was an army focus, and they were looking at the Soviet ground order of battle, or that. They were looking at their command and control, troop formations, movements, training, exercises, and equipment. And the equipment they were looking at were obviously tanks, armored personnel carriers, transport trucks, amphibious operations. Amphibious was really important because come the invasion that was expected at some stage, the Soviets would rampage across Germany, and they would have numerous river crossings, and the Soviets practiced all the time river crossings and basically got it down to a T. So amphibious operations, artillery, and small arms. And the observation, I mean, let's call it spying. It was spying, but the observation took place at barracks, training areas, tack routes, which were cross-country routes for tracked vehicles, so they could basically go from A to B without having to muck around with towns and junctions and civilians. And also the movement of troops and equipment in and out of the GDR. Then there was the air tour. Now, this was conversely an RAF focus. So they were looking at aircraft, helicopters, air defense systems, so surface-to-air missiles, and their associated radars. And consequently, they were looking at mainly airfields, but also sneaking up to surface-to-air missile batteries and other such installations. The pictures here give a sort of quite a good feeling for what it was all about. So a tour was a team of 3, and they were in a high performance, heavily modified vehicles. We'll talk about that in a minute, because that's normally quite good for a laugh. That the tour officer was in charge. He was in charge of the tour, but he also in charge of photography. He was normally a Russian linguist. That was quite important, and you'll see that in a minute. But also responsible for navigation, and he sat in the back of the vehicle. Picture 1 there in the top, that was a Mercedes G-Wagon, and we'll talk about these in a minute. But the rear bench seat was taken out, and a Recaro rally seat was put in a raised position in the center, which enabled the photographer, the officer, as you can see here, to shoot over the shoulders of his colleagues to get a clear view. The G-Wagon was also good because it had flat optical glass in it as well, so there was no distortions from a curved windscreen. So again, that was quite important. You then had the tour NCO, and he sat in the front passenger seat, and he was an expert in recognition of Warsaw Pact equipment, and his job was to record what was being seen, basically, in notebooks, but also you might better see there in his hand is a little dictaphone recorder. So he'd be sort of giving a running commentary to what the officer was taking. He also got involved in navigation, and then you had the driver. These were basically the unsung heroes of the whole thing. They were normally Royal Corps of Transport, or RAF, highly skilled drivers, and also responsible for security. A lot of them had come from, I forget the name of the unit, but they were responsible for moving tactical nuclear weapons around Germany. So they already had obviously a very high degree of training, but very high security clearances as well. And so their job was to drive, obviously get the car in and out of trouble, but they also pulled security as well. So a very important role. So the pictures you've got here, the first one is sort of subtitled "Running a Column," which is a posed picture. You can see there the tour NCO looks as though he's about to giggle, but yeah, that's very much the setup as it would be. And the uniform they're wearing there, you can see, was a unique uniform for BRIXMIS, with various different insignia and equipment. The air tour in picture number 2, well, you basically got the tour officer leaning on the roof of the car. He'd sometimes be through the sunroof as well, for elevated position. He'd sometimes even be standing on top of the roof. And you've got the tour NCO outside, providing a commentary, and the driver would normally be inside at the wheel, doors locked, and he'd be noting down what the tour NCO was saying, and also the officer would be shouting out film numbers and frame numbers and that sort of stuff. The bottom picture is a fantastic picture, a bit of a Hollywood shot here, but this is a BRIXMIS Opel Senator in action, driving across a very ploughed, rutted field there, and we'll talk about how on earth they managed to achieve that. But it's a dramatic photo, and I think it's just intended to be a bit of publicity. Well, actually not publicity, because they shunned publicity because they were a covert organization. But anyway, you talk to a driver and he'll say, yeah, that's just a Hollywood shot. They would very rarely make so much of an impact. So their job was to actually stay under the radar, but these cars were capable of doing just that. And then the other shot here is the other type of tour, is basically an aerial photographic reconnaissance sortie. And these were flown in a de Havilland Chipmunk trainer aircraft operating out of RAF Gatow. So they were flown from the back seat, with the observer and photographer up the front, like a tandem. You can see there, it's a tandem seat, photographing targets from as low as 300 feet. And they operated around this Berlin control zone. You remember the map at the beginning? But within that, there was a huge number of targets, and a lot of them were not accessible to ground tours. So it was great to be able to see things from above. So we've got a picture here. It's actually taken from 1990, because you'll notice that the Berlin Wall is actually down, although the mission was still operating then. Just take a quick drink. Only on one occasion, in April 1975, did a chipmunk come back with a bullet hole. So the crew landed after what they thought was a fairly normal but uneventful flight. As they were climbing out, the ground crew sort of said, "Excuse me, sir, do you realise there's a huge bullet hole in your propeller spinner?" Which they had no idea that it actually happened. And when the photos were developed overnight, there was a great photo showing a Soviet soldier next to a BMP-1 armored personnel carrier taking aim at the chipmunk. A foot or so back, it could have hit the engine, and that would have obviously been very serious, because there was only a couple of minutes of dead stick flying. A couple of feet further back, it would have hit the crew. So it was a serious incident, but luckily for all involved, it was they got away with it. Now this is a interesting, if not somewhat unsavory story. Tours also got involved in let's say dirty work, literally. So Operation Tamarisk, also known as Operation Tomahawk, that was exploiting intelligence from Soviet rubbish tips, or the mess left behind after training and deployments. The Soviets were not really very tidy, certainly compared to the British military. In fact, even the Western military, they were very messy. But this provided a really rich, if not rather unsanitary, source of intelligence. British soldiers, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, were issued with toilet paper as part of their daily ration packs. Seems quite sensible, doesn't it? The Soviets, on the other hand, weren't, and had to improvise using whatever came to hand. So pages torn from notebooks, from manuals, memos, letters, even maps. And all this soiled material, shall we say, was literally just chucked over the fence, or just left behind as litter in trenches or behind revetments at deployment areas. So tours would turn up in the dark of night. They called it doing a dump. That was the code name for it, or the popular name. And they basically pick through this rubbish, and a likely looking candidate was bagged up, double bagged up, and taken back to Berlin, where the material was dried out, separated from the unpleasantness, and then assessed by a special team of Russian linguists under the code name Spandau. This operation was highly secret, but it was unpleasant, but it yielded some extraordinary intelligence. So it's a sort of very unusual aspect of BRIXMIS history. The Americans did it as well. They called it Operation Sand Dune. I do believe the French did it as well. But it was a sort of uniquely mission type event. So let's talk a little bit about the geography. Tours had access to all of East Germany, and you see there's a couple of maps there showing East Germany, except for nominated restricted areas. Now, these were called permanent restricted areas, or PRA, which is much easier to say. And these PRAs covered areas of particular military sensitivity or significance, so training areas, the main troop concentrations, all of the inner German border. So you'll see there on the left of both maps, the restricted area runs literally all down the border, but also covered the borders with Czechoslovakia in the southeast, and Poland to the east. Also the Baltic coast, you can see all along the Baltic coast. So this was territory out of bounds to the touring, the Allied military liaison missions. BAOR had equivalent reciprocal restrictions on SOCMIS. And the whole idea was that you respect these restrictions or get into really quite big trouble. The PRAs evolved over time, and then every now and then, normally in January, the Group of Soviet Forces Germany would issue a brand new map, and then that would be circulated around to the missions. And this is an interesting comparison. So it's over a 10-year period from 1978 to 1988, and you can see how they ebbed and flowed. The inner German border remained within the restriction because that was obviously highly sensitive, but for example, the Baltic coast opened up, as did good chunks of the Polish border and the Czech border. So there was some movement there within the restrictions. There was another type of restriction called a temporary restricted area, or TRA, and that was imposed from a specific time period, normally to cover a particular exercise, or if there was a interesting bit of kit arriving, perhaps a new main battle tank, it would be put on under a TRA. And these were hand drawn onto large scale maps. I picked this map up in the National Army Museum in London, and you can see with a little inset there just how vague that restriction was. So the missions basically exploited this vagueness to as much as they could. Oh no, that line definitely is across the other side of the road. It definitely, and this was the discussion that went on. One of the weird interpretations the Soviets had was that the RMA did not cover these restrictions did not cover autobahns. So you can see here that you've got this is a restriction in 1973 from the 22nd of May to the 3rd of June between Dresden and Leipzig in south eastern East Germany, and for some reason they decided not to restrict the autobahn. You can see that sort of diagonal line going there. So even though the whole area was restricted, the missions could drive up and down the autobahn with impunity and quite often could see what was going on. So it was a bit of a loophole, which of course the missions exploited to the hilt. There's a further type of restriction there called a mission restricted sign, or MRS. Now, these were put up around military installations, but they weren't covered under the RMA. So basically, the missions ignored them. It was SOP to just ignore the signs. They treated it as an advertisement that there was something interesting going on. It did cause a lot of incidents and a lot of confrontation, but that they chose to officially ignore these signs. Many signs got liberated as souvenirs. It was basically a rite of passage for a mission member to steal his first MRS sign. So, but of course, as soon as they got stolen, a new one got put up. The Germans were very efficient at that sort of thing. So, the whole point of all this activity was to gather intelligence. Tools were looking for kit. So kit was the sort of code word for something that was interesting. It could be a vehicle, could be whatever. You see the images here. A scoop, on the other hand, was something brand new, something that hadn't been seen before, or it was really unusual. And so obviously the highly competitive military types, they were always looking for something that was new, and they'd better claim it as a scoop. There's loads of examples in the book. Here you can see that there's a SS-20 ballistic missile there they found. On the other side, there's a S-300 air defense system. Got a MiG there at the top. A lot of this hardware is actually now being used in Ukraine, which is quite interesting. So what goes around comes around. But all these bits of information, or all these images here, are specific images taken by the mission showing this was how they captured their intelligence. And they say the book is packed full of examples of these. One of my favorite stories is shown in picture 6 there. That's Staff Sergeant Ken Wyke, he was Royal Artillery. He jumped onto a slowly moving kit train that they were doing a rail watch, which basically meant parking up by the side of a railway or a junction and waiting for a train to come past. And that could often yield some very valuable information. Anyway, he saw this kit train carrying the new BMP-2 armored personnel carrier. It was brand new into country. They didn't know what the caliber of the gun was, and that was a main intelligence objective. So he jumped up on the moving train, had an apple in his pocket. He jammed the apple over the muzzle of the gun to try and determine the caliber. He also, perhaps a little bit more scientifically, held his dictaphone against the muzzle, and the tour photographer back in the car with a massive long lens was snapping away so that they could actually get something a little bit more empirical. He then jumped down from the train as the Soviets woke up that there was something going on, and they legged it. The apple, unfortunately, had disintegrated by the time they got back to West Berlin, but it's a good story. But Wyke's bravery got him the British Empire Medal. But it's just a story showing the spirit and the sort of the lengths they went to. You should remember that all this, of course, is in the pre-digital photographic age. So photos taken on tour, and they burnt through an awful lot of film, would be developed and printed by an outfit called the Special Section, which was their RAF in-house professional photographic lab. And they'd produce black and white prints or color slides, and generally dropped off the night before. By the time the guys came into the office in the following morning, the prints or the slides would be there waiting for them. And then the tour officer and the NCO could start to review all the findings, compare them with the notes that they'd made and that sort of thing. And then they bring in the weapons team or the research team, various different intelligence specialists within the office to look at anything particularly interesting. And all this intelligence that they're picking up here fed into the NATO intelligence machine. You've got the MOD in London, you've got JHQ in Rheindahlen, which was the headquarters of the British forces in Germany. And this was a massive, great sausage machine of intelligence. And obviously, BRIXMIS was one of several key sources there. When they got back after each tour, they filled in this thing called a tour highlights form. And then that was shared with the French and American missions. So they basically shared the information between them. And that was quite important because you didn't want to stumble onto a hornet's nest stirred up by one of your compatriots. The urgent findings or specific technical reports would be forwarded to NATO headquarters, to, as I say, JHQ at Rheindahlen, but also to the relevant desk officer at the MOD. And this was a constant refining process. The Defence Intelligence Staff members would send across intelligence requirements, and I mentioned obviously that one of them was the caliber of the gun on the BMP. So the missions would generally coordinate the very important intelligence sources. The picture at the bottom there is the T-80 tank, which was a massive campaign by all three missions to basically find out this this new tank, and again that's now being used in Ukraine. So all this contributed to NATO's overall assessment of Warsaw Pact's ORBAT disposition and capability, and formed a key part of the alliance's early warning system. They basically monitored these indicators of hostility, and BRIXMIS had a big part in that. So we talked about tour cars. So basically, the mission had a range of special equipment to do their job. Cameras, we'll talk about in a minute. It's another area of interest for me, and I think the audiences generally are quite interested in that. And tour cars. So basically, a tour car had to take 3 personnel in reasonable comfort, plus all their equipment, and there was a lot of equipment. It had to give excellent performance on and also off-road. It had to be a very stable photographic platform, and as I said, that certainly the RAF tours would generally often stand on top of the cars. get a good vantage point. And it had to be an office and a sort of temporary home for the tourists for the duration of the tour. And the tours could last anywhere between 3, 4, even 5 days out in the field. So these tour cars, they were very carefully selected, extensively modified, lovingly maintained, and driven harder than you'd get away with pretty much anywhere else in the military. Sometimes it was less like motoring and more like rallying. And obviously that picture you saw of the senator blasting through the mud was a good example. Although, as my friends who were former drivers, they said that's a little bit Hollywood. So one of the key points is that all of this equipment was funded by the West German federal government through the occupation budget. And the funds were administered by the West Berlin Senate, the West Berlin government. So BRIXMIS didn't have to go through the normal MOD procurement and could deal with direct with manufacturers, be it Opel, Mercedes, Nikon. They didn't have to go through all the hoops. They could also afford the best equipment on the market, and that was important because they had a very challenging mission. There's loads about the cars in the book, but they used initially Opels primarily, which is obviously the German version of Vauxhall, excuse me, and then Mercedes. So in the pictures 1 and 2, you've got these are from the early 1950s. They used Opel Capitans. They then in the 60s moved to Admirals, Opel Admirals, and then in the 1970s and onwards, Opel Senators. So pictures 1 and 2 shows the same vehicle or the same type of vehicle, but a strange sort of schizophrenic side of touring. So you've got the image at the top with a highly polished Opel Capitan there with a driver in his best number ones. Must have been some sort of protocol visit, so they must have been driving chief to a meeting or something, versus the shot at the bottom, which is, as it happens, it's a broken down vehicle in the middle of a field, absolutely caked in mud. So you had this very strange sort of, as I say, this schizophrenic existence. The early cars were not four-wheel drive, so they relied on having pretty powerful engines, good tires, good fuel, because obviously the fuel in East Germany was very poor quality, and they also had this underbody armored protection. They called them panzer plates, and they were literally steel plates welded underneath the car. So they basically use power, kinetic energy, to ride over objects. The Opel Senator, as you can see at the top there in the middle, that arrived in the early 80s, and that became much more refined. But these vehicles were anything but standard. Let's take another swig of drink. Yeah, anything but standard. So we mentioned the panzer plates. Now that added something like half a ton to the all-up weight of the vehicle, but they had special long-range fuel tanks put in, and there were all kinds of other sort of sneaky-beaky specialist mods that went on. The biggest game changer, however, was something called the Ferguson formula four-wheel drive conversion. So this came about in the mid-70s, and it was a pretty heavy engineering solution that turned a two-wheel drive Admiral or Senator executive saloon car basically into a four-wheel drive off-road monster. It was a really useful bit of kit. So it was a retrofit four-wheel drive system. In the middle there, you'll see this famous James Bond switch, which is a very popular story in BRIXMIS folklore. So basically this was a custom lighting panel, and it was either between the front seats, as you can see there, or it was a panel on the mounted on the dash. And this switch allowed you to control each of the different individual lights individually. So you could go dark at the flick of a switch, and obviously when night vision goggles came along, you had this very scary prospect of the driver driving along in the pitch dark without any lights, wearing night vision goggles, and that must have been pretty scary for the passengers. But also you could mimic motorcycle lights, or you could even have this sort of dim Trabant East German headlights. So it was a huge tactical advantage. So you can see the panel there from an Opel Senator. The Range Rover came along at around the same time. So that's obviously a four-wheel drive vehicle, albeit only a three-door version at the time. It was very capable off-road, but unfortunately it was a product of the 1970s British motor industry, and I'm sure many people listening this evening will know that less said about that the better. It was unreliable, it was leaky, it was drafty in the winter, dusty in the summer, although it was extremely capable off-road. And the picture at the bottom was a fairly common sight, unfortunately, a Range Rover on a recovery trailer, and then to rub salt into the wound, it's being towed by a German Mercedes G-Wagon. One of my favourite stories involves there was a Range Rover on tour, and it happened to be broken down, and it was being towed along by another Range Rover, and they bumped into a BBC film crew who were making a documentary about Johann Sebastian Bach, because I think he was born somewhere in what was the East Germany. The BBC person came up to the tour officer and said, tell me, do you always carry a spare car? Which is quite a nice little story there. Anyway, getting bogged in was a pretty regular occurrence, even with four-wheel drive. But also vehicles broke down. That could happen because, as I said, they were driven very hard, or they were immobilized after getting into scrapes with the opposition. Again, that happened, or they had a straightforward road traffic accident. So there's a picture there, lovely picture of a Senator deeply embedded in a huge great hole on a tack route. That's from 1982, but they were taught a whole range of recovery techniques, and even though they were in this huge great hole, a couple of hours worth of effort, and they would generally be able to get themselves out of most issues. The ultimate tour car probably has to be this G-Wagon, the Mercedes G-Wagon, and that arrived in 1980. It transformed touring. Basically, it was fast on the road and off the road. It had extraordinary off-road performance. It had four doors, which is obviously a big step up from the two-door Range Rover. Loads more space, had a very powerful electric winch in the front bumper. And you'll see there a tour officer lounging on the bonnet of his G-Wagon. So the other area of specialist equipment was the camera. Obviously, photography was hugely important because that was the way that intelligence was collected and disseminated. So tour officers had to become, in effect, professional photographers. They had to become very proficient in photography. Most of the guys would never have seen a professional camera before they joined or started training for the mission, but they were using the best kit and using very specialist techniques, so they had to learn quickly. You had obviously the lab I mentioned back at the office, and all kinds of very clever photographic techniques, both in shooting but also in how it was processed. So started off using Leica cameras, which is anybody knowing their cameras, the Leica was basically the Rolls-Royce of cameras, and they used that in the 1950s there. There's a RAF tour officer with a Leica taken in 1958. We're not sure what camera that guy's using in the bottom picture there, but you can see how impractical some of these cameras were. Having to use a look-down viewfinder while trying to track a moving aircraft must have been quite a challenge. But the East Germans, as it happened, produced very decent optical products. So the brand Praktika is a good example. And so they did use East German products. The picture at the top there is a good example of an air tour in operation. So you've got the officer there using a motor drive camera with a whacking great lens. He's snapping away merrily. The tour NCO is tracking the action on his binoculars, and as I say, unseen in the vehicle, there'd be the tour driver noting down what the guys are shouting at him. He'd also be the driver would also be keeping an eye in the opposite direction just to see there was no dodgy people sneaking up on them. The mission then moved to Nikon cameras, and you'll see here they moved to the Nikons with the f2 picture number 4 there in 1971, and there's that picture we mentioned earlier. That's with a Nikon f3 with a telephoto lens, and you can see here that this is the sort of like the classic camera setup they'd use. You'd have a camera body with a powerful motor drive, and then you'd have a massive, great mirror lens. And these mirror lenses were about as important an innovation as the four-wheel drive system was on the vehicles. Basically, they were a very clever sequence of mirrors inside a lens housing that condensed that lens you see there. I think it's a 500 or even 1,000 millimeter mirror lens, so it condenses it into a much smaller package. Imagine having to stick a whole meter, 1,000 millimeter focal length on without this technology, you'd be knocking people over with the lens. Now, there's a bizarre story with that basically the Russians developed the mirror lens first. There was this 1,000 millimeter MTO lens that was developed. So the military attaché in Moscow was basically given instructions to acquire one. He sent it back to London in the diplomatic pouch. It was then flown out to Berlin, West Berlin, and then used to photograph Russians in East Germany. So it was this nice sort of virtuous circle there. So photography was really important. The other thing they had to do was obviously fend for themselves in the field. So to start with, Tours used hotels. This was in the early 50s. Turned out not to be that secure, bearing in mind that the Stasi were basically bugging rooms and doing all sorts of dodgy interventions. So basically, by the late 50s, when the Stasi interventions got too much, they decided to start camping out. So basically, the tour officer and the NCO always slept outside the car. And it didn't matter if there was a foot of snow or -20, they would always sleep outside. So they obviously had to have camping equipment to accommodate that. The driver always stayed inside the car with the doors locked, because obviously he would be able to provide some degree of security for all the tour equipment that was inside. I'm not sure sleeping in the car was necessarily that comfortable, but at least he wasn't out in the elements. They called their camping spots Z-Platzes. Or Z-Platz, and they were chosen very carefully because they needed them to be fairly close to the objective, but basically out of sight of the opposition. The invention of the one-man Gore-Tex pop-up tent, basically the SAS pioneered this technology, and you can see a picture of it in pictures 1 and 2. It's a pop-up tent, and then the guys would configure their own bedroll, a combination of different blow-up mattresses, sort of carry mats, insulated sheets, and all that sort of stuff. So basically, the idea was that you better get your tent up in the dark and be in your sleeping bag in about 60 seconds. That was the idea. So reasonably comfortable, although the chap in the picture there doesn't look too happy about it. But anyway, there you are. And the setup there, you can see at the top, that's a typical Z-Platz. You've got the G-Wagon there and the 2 tents. One of the drivers was telling me he built this sort of wooden platform that went over the seats, so at least he had a sort of fairly horizontal, stable bed. So that was quite a good idea. So in terms of food, they obviously had to survive out in the field for, as I said, up to 3, sometimes 4 or even 5 days. So they took packed lunches with them, or ingredients to cook up as they needed to, especially if they were stationary for some time doing a rail watch, for example. So you've got there a great picture of a driver grilling a sausage over a primus stove, and then in the middle there you've got the famous Tor curry, and that was part of BRIXMIS folklore. Basically, all the personnel would contribute some ingredients. It was all bunged in a pot, and it was sometimes cooked inside the car. That's being cooked up there in the front of a G-Wagon. The East German cream cakes and ice creams were generally pretty good, and tourers looked forward to stopping for a cake run or an ice cream run. But the Chernobyl disaster, the nuclear power station disaster in 1986, caused massive contamination across Europe, and orders came down from on high that tour personnel had to avoid East German dairy products because basically there was a genuine risk of contamination. So that spoilt their fun. So as I said, the other custom, the tour curry, was one custom, but another one was making sure that the driver could guarantee a brew stop every 2 hours, and woe betide any tour officer who didn't follow that lead. So every morning they brew up a load of thermos flasks, and you can see the brew up taking place in the snow. So what were they up against? And I've alluded to some of this already. So the opposition was primarily the Soviet forces, the group of Soviet forces Germany, but also the East German NVA, the East German military. You also had the Stasi, which was the infamous East German secret police. Now, the East Germans, as I mentioned earlier, they had no powers of arrest, or that they couldn't legally detain a tour, but they certainly could intercept them, and they could certainly stop them. And that was done through varying degrees of violence. Then they'd basically hand them over to the Soviets, who would then do the necessary paperwork. So you had rammings. They were relatively commonplace, more often than you would actually think. Sometimes they were deliberate ambushes. Sometimes shots were fired, and occasionally they did hit the target. So these pictures, I think, tell the picture speaks 1,000 words here. So you've got a shot here from the 1950s, a tire being changed. You can see there are sort of snow chains on that tire there. The vehicle in the background is a Stasi car, so that's rather close observation. It's not exactly subtle. The shot below, number 2, was from the late 60s, and this was a radar site, a Soviet radar site. The tour basically were taking pictures. They heard a shot, left the scene rather quickly, as you would, and when they got back, they actually saw the soldier pointing directly at the camera, but thankfully his marksmanship was a bit rubbish. Anyway, that was a good story to talk about in the bar afterwards. So number 3, that was a really nasty ramming incident from 1976, forced off the road by a couple of motorbikes and then rammed by a 4.5-ton East German truck. The tour officer, who I know, had a really badly broken leg and then had to sort of spend a rather uncomfortable time in an East German hospital. But you can see the state of the vehicle there. Equipment was regularly stolen. Some of it quite sensitive information. There you can see some American night vision goggles that were stolen in 1982. And some of it was paraded on East German territory, East German television as well. You've got at the top there, oh, excuse me, I'm losing my voice a bit. Basically, you've got a tour NCO there, having to show diplomatic restraint in light of some fairly rough handling. Basically, if he'd have lost his cool and taken a swipe at that officer, it could have actually led to quite a serious incident. So yeah, diplomatic restraint was a key skill. The picture on the right is a really important one. This was in August 1982, and Chief BRIXMIS, who's the boss, was driving along on a tour when a 12-ton East German Air Force truck zoomed out of an entrance and basically T-boned the side of the vehicle. It was a deliberate ambush, and the intention was to kill a member of a mission. Didn't matter who was in, whether it was French, American, or British. But as it happened, this particular time, it had a Brigadier General in the back seat. Thankfully, you'll see that tree there. That's General Learmont leaning against the tree there. Thankfully, that small tree saved their lives, because it took the impact and the strength and the protection of the vehicle managed to they survived with just a few cuts and bruises. Would you believe it, that vehicle actually could drive up onto the recovery trailer under its own steam? So that just shows you how strong they were. And then you got a great shot from 1987. This was taken, those are Spetsnaz, so that's GRU Special Forces, and you could tell that they're Spetsnaz because they're wearing camouflage uniforms. So they're on top of a BRDM to APC. They're basically chasing the tour car. The tour car is at the moment in reverse, driving at full speed in reverse. So basically the tour officer, a guy called Stephen Harrison, was shooting over the shoulders of the driver, and then the driver did this extraordinary J-turn, high-speed J-turn, and basically went from reverse to forward, and basically they managed to head off into the sunset. The guy on the right there, you can see he's got his assault rifle with him. He's let off several bursts of fire, but thankfully the APC bouncing along meant they didn't reach the target. But that's a cracking photo. They got into a number of quite close scrapes, and I think it's important that we actually do consider this for a second. So there were several very near misses where people escaped with their lives by luck. So the first really serious incident was in 1962, and an RAF corporal, a guy called Corporal Day, was shot multiple times by an East German border guard. Thankfully, he survived, but he was really badly injured. But thankfully, he survived and retired, I think, from the RAF as a warrant officer in 1990. So he went on to have a good career, but he was badly injured. Then I mentioned, obviously, that incident with Chief BRIXMIS. As I said, that was a deliberate assassination attempt, but thankfully that tree helped them. However, unfortunately, that didn't last. And in 1984, there was the first fatality, and that was I can't really say this. Adjutant, I think it's adjutant chef, which is like a warrant officer, Philippe Mariotti of the French mission. He was killed in this horrendous ramming incident. Again, a deliberate ambush, which was orchestrated by the Stasi with the KGB, and they used the East German Army, the NVA, to basically execute it. But yeah, he died. The driver and the NCO were very badly injured in this incident, and that was in March 1984. Then the following year, Major Arthur Nicholson from the US military liaison mission, he was shot and killed by a Soviet sentry. That was in March 85, outside a T-80 tank shed. And that was a really serious incident. I mean, we're talking reaching the White House and the Kremlin, and it turned out to be a really big incident. What struck me really when I was doing this research was how random it all was. So a tour could be targeted at any moment, be they French, British, or American. They could be anywhere in the GDR. So literally every time they crossed that bridge and entered East Germany, they were at the risk of being subject to serious, if not fatal, violence. It was a real case of Russian roulette. So it just really shows you the bravery of these guys who would basically keep going out day after day after day in quite tricky conditions. These pictures here just give you an idea of some of the interventions. So the first one is sandwiching. I mean, that Range Rover is not going anywhere. I did read about a story where the Soviets put landmines in front of the wheels, so they couldn't go forward and they couldn't go back. So that was quite an efficient way of immobilizing the tour. The second picture there is tarping, and that's basically a really heavy tarpaulin was thrown over the tour car, and that could, on a hot summer's day, that could actually get quite nasty in terms of struggling to get any air inside the vehicle. And then ramming. So let's say ramming was quite a commonplace event, and here you see a G-Wagon being basically crunched by a Soviet truck. What you don't see in this picture was just onto the other side of it was a railway line. So that was a very dangerous situation. On the bottom there, you've got basically the interaction with the Soviet officers. So you've got Stephen Harrison there at the bottom trying to talk his way out of trouble. That's why being a Russian linguist was very important. But basically, the commandant would arrive. He was like a provost marshal or RMP sort of character, and he would laboriously prepare this thing called an act, which is like an affidavit or a statement. He'd investigate it, take loads of photos, measurements, and all that sort of thing. Would write it up into this act, and then he'd ask the tour officer to sign it. And basically, SOP says, no, you don't sign it. So, you know, this pantomime went on every time the tour was detained. So you've got the bottom there, that's a RAF squadron leader there, listening to the accusation. And obviously you can see the photograph was pointedly taken under one of those mission restricted signs. Not that it meant anything to the officer, because he ignored them. And then the last picture there, another, I think he's RAF officer, unusually not wearing his beret. The only times they put on headgear was crossing the bridge and being detained. So I don't know why this particular officer is hatless or beretless. But anyway, he's being shown the act, the affidavit document, and as I say, at the end of it, he politely declined to sign it. These detentions could be fairly amicable. I mean, there's some great stories of where they become even quite farcical, but they could very quickly turn nasty. There's some blood-curdling stories of violence in the book, which just show you that the challenges these guys faced. The ultimate sanction for the tour officer, injury or death notwithstanding, was to be declared persona non grata, PNG, and that meant that basically their tour at the mission would cease. They'd be unable to enter East Germany, and so therefore they'd become in effect useless to the mission. It was a really expensive mistake or problem to have, so it was quite a serious issue. And the balance between the missions, the Soviets equivalents, and the respective hosts was pretty much over the decades kept in check by the principle of reciprocity. Basically, what you do to us, we can do to you. And that balance, that knowledge that you start mucking tours around in a certain way, well, we will do the same to your guys. That basically kept it relatively on an even keel. Both sides recognized the value of using the missions for intelligence work. As I say, the original objective was to form a communication channel, a liaison channel, but really it came down to intelligence collection, spying. So the Soviets did tend to push the spirit, shall we say, of the RMA. As I said, they were GRU mostly, some KGB, but they did use their touring inside West Germany for straightforward espionage. They'd go out in civies. They'd sometimes use unmarked cars. They'd service agents, dead drops, all the sort of sneaky spy stuff, which was really against the spirit of the agreement. But this self-policing more or less worked right through to 1990 when the mission closed. And speaking of which, swig a drink.
Andrew, just to let you know, we're 10 minutes over already. So if you want to get some questions in.
This is the last slide. Basically, the Berlin Wall opened in 1989, and really the mission ceased to have a role in the new Germany. So basically, they were forced to close. But I'll just sort of give you see some pictures here. That's the Trabants crossing the Glienicke Bridge into West Berlin, and you'll see that there the last picnic in 1990. That was the day before German reunification. There's a very good phrase from a very senior MOD guy who described this mission. So bear in mind, we're talking something that ran continually for 44 years, sending tours out every day. This MOD official described BRIXMIS as a unique organization which operated in a unique period of history, and its products were uniquely valuable. So there you go. So that, thank you for listening me waffle on.
Andrew, that was not waffling on, my friend. That was fascinating. If you'd just like to stop sharing your screen, please.
Oh yeah, okay, can do.
And then we can do some questions. If you're happy to stay online,
Yeah, sure.
we've still got everywhere. Most people still seem to be there, so that's brilliant. The first question is, for me, is what would you say the single biggest achievement of BRIXMIS was?
It's strange, really. The to understand the unusual, you had to understand the usual. Yeah. So for to get a advanced indication of something perhaps a little bit sinister going on, you had to really understand what the normal operation was. These guys, because they were out there literally every day, if they spotted something that was a bit out of the ordinary, that would then sound warning bells. So it was a very important indicator, an early warning system, basically.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was also thinking, because you talk a lot about there seems to be a lot more aggression from the Soviet side or the East German side, especially in the 80s. You know, that's the time of Able Archer, isn't it? When I think the Soviet leadership was feeling quite more paranoid than they normally do.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the violence was throughout. It started really getting nasty in the late 50s.
Okay.
So yeah, you're right though. The stuff going on with Able Archer was relevant, and these indicators of indicators of hostility, not histology, hostility, were key. That you know that there was a wall panel in the MOD in London, and you know somebody was there changing these indicators based on the daily reports from the mission. So yeah, really important.
Really important. Thank you. Right, we've got some questions here. Ellen, will this recording be available later? Assuming that it's worked on YouTube, yes. Richard has a question. Will there be a link sent out to buy the book? Yes, I've just put that into the chat for everyone to see.
Excellent.
Pen and Sword. And also Andrew's first book, which he talked about right at the beginning, is available through Pen and Sword as well. And asks, were there any British casualties? I believe a US major was murdered by a Soviet soldier when he was receiving a military not sure what you mean there, probably surveilling a military site in 85.
Yeah, so that's the story with Nick Nicholson. The mission were on a real, well, all the missions were on this coordinated approach to try and find out this elusive T-80 tank, and the T-80 was a big step change in terms of capability. It was a gas turbine tank. It was, you know, it was state of the art back then, and Nick was at a tank shed, basically next to a range, and was out of the car trying to enter the building, and a Soviet sentry appeared out of the trees, probably been having a kip, but turned up, and then without warning, basically let fire, open fire, and a bullet missed the driver by a couple of inches, but unfortunately hit Nicholson. It's a very controversial story, but basically he was left to bleed out just behind the vehicle. The Soviet guy wouldn't let the driver give any first aid, just basically held the gun to the driver's head, and Nicholson unfortunately died on the spot.
Crikey. That's very aggressive, isn't it?
It caused a massive stink, as you can imagine.
I can imagine. Joe asks, how were operators selected and what training did they undertake?
So drivers were just sort of swept up. As I mentioned, there was that unit in West Germany that was already doing some fairly high security work. So they would come that way. Tour NCOs were generally sort of poached from other units. They were generally staff sergeants, warrant officers, but very capable NCOs. Officers were recruited really by word of mouth, and then began a 2-year preparation for a 2-year posting. So they would have had to have learnt Russian to interpreter level. That was like I can't remember how long, but it was a very intensive course. But then there was all the recognition training. And in the mid 70s, a sort of formal training program was put in place, where they were able to share experiences and basically get the guys blasting around Salisbury Plain in a real tour car, being chased by the directing staff playing the Stasi. So it was, eventually became a very solid training program. But to start with, it was pretty improvised.
Richard asked, were they volunteers, or because when you're saying the drivers were swept up, or were they just literally chosen at random drivers and then selected for the officers?
They were, well, do you volunteer in the British Army for stuff? I don't think you do really. You get posted, I think. So certainly the NCOs and drivers were posted, but officers, I know, for example, Peter Williams, who's the chairman of the BRIXMIS Association, he saw these guys driving around in filthy cars and getting up to all sorts of mischief, and basically said, I want that job. So it took him 2 or 3 years to actually maneuver himself to be able to get that posting. But they all came from the combat arms of the military, so of the army in particular. So parachute regiment, infantry regiments, engineers, signals, special forces. I mean, there was a strong SAS contingent at the mission pretty much constantly.
Wow, it's quite a mixed bag, isn't it?
Yeah.
Chris says, thank you, Andrew. Great presentation. You mentioned the listening in done by the opposition. Did we do any reciprocal listening in?
Well, I can't speak for what the military intelligence guys got up to. Perhaps one day I'll write a book on it. But yeah, so audio intelligence or acoustic intelligence was actually quite important. They used this contraption, they called it the black banana. And I think it was about 3 or 4 feet long. And it was basically a really high powered, it was top secret. It was the boffins at Porton Down or somewhere made this bit of kit, and it was a hugely powerful directional microphone. But again, it was about 3 or 4 foot long, and you poke it out the window of your car, and it could pick up the sound of a tank or a firing of a gun from several kilometers away, and they basically record it. So yeah, acoustic intelligence was actually quite an important mix. There's a good story where they were one of the guys was observing a bombing run from an aircraft, and was able to use his dictaphone to record how many seconds of flight this particular missile took from the moment of release, and so that they were able to improvise using the equipment they had with them.
So not just listening to voices, for example. There are many different ways you can use it. Engines, I guess, as well, can't you?
Yeah, listening to voices wasn't really their sort of thing. That there were plenty of other intelligence operators doing that sort of stuff. But certainly listening to kit, yeah, that was actually quite an important part.
Question from Edward: if wholesale hostilities were to start, did the mission have a specific role already being behind enemy lines?
So those who served in Berlin would be aware of something called Rocking Horse, which was basically the emergency deployment exercises that were run quite regularly, and basically the infantry brigades would bug out of their barracks and head off and that sort of stuff. So it was a big deal. BRIXMIS were exempt from Rocking Horse exercises. It was assumed that they would be operating with special forces. If the balloon went up, that they'd be operating with special forces. It was also assumed that they'd be deliberately targeted by Stasi, because they were all known, that they all had files, Stasi files. So there was a fairly good chance that they would be taken out. They would be targeted for assassination at the start of hostilities. But failing that, the BRIXMIS would have had a nebulous role with special forces somehow, but as I said, that they were excused the regular Rocking Horse deployments.
Okay, thank you. Colin asks, could they communicate with the West? I guess that means there's some sort of headquarters, or did they have to wait until the end of the tour?
Yeah, good. That's a very good question. They were incommunicado throughout the tour, and that worked that had benefits, because basically at the time, to be able to, if say you were, across the other side of East Germany, if you had radio equipment which could communicate back to base or conceivably communicate across to West Germany, it would take up half the vehicle. It just wasn't, they weren't geared up for it. The technology wasn't there at the time, which a mobile phone now would do. But so they basically headed off incommunicado. They used, if there was an incident or they had a crash or something, they'd use their contacts at SERB in Potsdam to relay a message back to the mission house, and then the mission house would send out a recovery truck or whatever. In the 80s, there was this very secret pager technology that was used. It's like a little Motorola pager about the size of a packet of cigarettes, and it was secreted inside somewhere behind the dash that it looked like some electronic box. Basically, they had the opportunity that if, for example, if a TRA was established, they could send this beeper would send a message to this beeper, and then it was a one-off deal. They'd beep it, they'd take the unit apart. In next to the battery, there'd be a grid reference, and then they could basically then head straight from that grid reference where another TOR could RV with them, and they could share intelligence. So that there was this one-way communication that came, as I say, in the late 80s, called Operation Talon Snatch, I think it was called. But no, for most of the time, they basically were on their own.
It's difficult to appreciate how archaic by our standards the technology was back then, I think.
Absolutely.
And Jeffrey asks, sorry, go on.
So, and the success they had in spite of that. I mean, yes. that's the thing that's really striking.
Jeffrey asks, you called the Soviets as the enemy on more than one occasion. I was always trained to understand them as to be the potential enemy. Is this the true outlook of the team members?
They were the adversary. They obviously, the mission were seeing these guys preparing for war, literally preparing for war, exercising, breaking in new equipment. There was no doubt that the BRIXMIS's role was helping the West prepare to defend. So yeah, they were a former ally. There was no war declared. There was no hostilities declared. But this confrontation lasted all the way. Well, lasted 44 years, didn't it?
Yes.
Over 4 decades of undeclared conflict. But I mean, if you look at some of the violence that went on and the injuries and damage, it was very much a hostile environment that they were operating in. There was nothing benign about what they were experiencing. So from a semantics point of view, perhaps not a declared enemy from an international law perspective, but they were certainly the opposition. Yeah,
and as we've already alluded to, they're certainly playing quite rough, shall we say? So I think I can understand why people would say that.
Yeah.
Were there any casualties with the Soviet missions in West Germany, and were the Soviet missions treated with so much hostility in the West?
There were 2 organizations basically trying to keep tabs of the SOXMIS. So you had I think they were called 19 Support Platoon of the RMP, and they were nicknamed the White Mice because their cars were basically souped up, Granadas and sort of high speed pursuit cars. But they were painted white, which is where the nickname came from. And they were the overt side of the anti-SOXMIS control. The covert side was basically military intelligence. So, guys sneaking around in bushes. I think it's fair to say that the British interventions were robust. The British version of tarping was basically using a British Army blanket. So, they sort of tucked them up under a blanket. But I think that the interventions were robust, but they certainly did not do the same degree of violence by any shadow of a doubt. There would have been injuries on the Soviet thing, more likely through traffic accidents than physical violence on behalf of the authorities.
Thank you. Stuart asks, wasn't Ranulph Fiennes a BRIXMIS officer?
Not that I know of. I don't think he was. I think he was SAS.
I knew, yes, he was definitely in the SAS, but obviously Stuart's asking about that. So if anybody knows, maybe there's some lead for you.
Yeah, I almost certain he wasn't.
Okay. Jeffrey asks, not a question, but a statement. So he doesn't ask, he makes a statement. A very interesting talk on a subject I've heard of before, but the anecdotes and personal view that make it really quite fascinating. Nick says, this has been excellent. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Did any naval or Marines personnel take part?
Good question. Well, you saw the map earlier of the Baltic coast. So basically, I think in 1952 or 53, the East Germans established the inner German border, and so they basically fortified the border between the two Germanies. At the same time, they cut off the Baltic coast. So, what is a naval officer without a sea? They basically didn't have a role. So to start with, there were Royal Navy and Royal Marine representatives on the mission, but again, come the mid-50s, that became redundant, if you like. There was a Royal Navy representative who came in the sort of mid to late 80s, and as you saw, the actual coastline did open up there. Although the individual, he was a warrant officer, I think. He was actually brought in for his special operations experience from Northern Ireland rather than his naval experience. So yes, there was a Royal Naval, guy from the in the late 80s, but to say he was more a special operations guy.
Thank you. Mike makes a quick comment. He says, I remember when Soviet officers used to visit our camps and look in the hangars to count tanks. We had to cover up offices and op boards, etc. Was this part of the same agreement, and did we do the same?
Well, I think one of the funny things is, of course, they call it open source intelligence these days, but the Socksmiths guys just had to go along to their local NAFI and buy a copy of Soldier magazine or the American Stars and Stripes or whatever, and you better get detailed discussions about various bits of military equipment. Even the local papers did sort of like community days and open days for the public. So it was very easy for them to get the sort of equipment, the sort of information that BRIXMIS had to really work hard to get. So yeah, it was a slightly different mix. The challenges were different, should we say, on both sides.
I'm guessing the Soviets didn't do T-80 main battle tank open days then.
But believe you me, no, they didn't. But then what was really interesting is after the war fell down, there was a successor organisation to BRIXMIS called JISB. It's all a little bit sort of in the shadows. It was quite a sort of like secret operation. But they basically, as soon as the sort of the Cold War fizzled out, the Soviets would open up their barracks and try and sell off their equipment. So, and they would hold open days. So for 4 decades, it had been sort of like ultra secret, but then they were bringing people in and selling them uniforms and selling them vodka. And so the equipment that they'd sweated blood and tears to try and find, they were invited to have a look at. So it was a very bizarre time in the early 90s, where there were still Soviets in Germany right through to 1994. So there was still intelligence to be gathered right up to that time. But BRIXMIS, as I said, finished in October 90.
That sounds like the mother of all car boot sales. And on that very bizarre... Andrew, that just leaves me to say thank you so much for that talk. Sorry to have to nag you a little bit towards the end.
No problem.
I know how easy it is to sort of when you get into these things, and it was worth listening to for sure. Loads of great questions. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.